possessed. He just looked evil.
Welcome. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. Now this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and in the information provided to detectives, his wife explained that although she had known her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. Now, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of those charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts. Now, he was also found guilty of 7 counts of attempted homicide. Now, Peter displayed no emotion as his sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear at the sound of my own flashing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Now, that is just disgusting and ew. Number 9. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting the Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. Now, during his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of up to 40 million people. He died in August of 1227, but his death was kept a closely guarded secret. Now, according to legend, Genghis Khan's last words were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave you." Now, whether he uttered those short sentences or not, his successors were more than happy to take up the challenge. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee, where he would then dismember them. It has been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A detailed search of his apartment revealed 4 severed heads in his kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in his bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray in the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of an arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found, which is just disgusting. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life and was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Then on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate. His last words were, "Christ Jesus came to the world to save all sinners, of whom I am the worst." Number 7. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial slayer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot and robbed 7 of her male clients. Now, she claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, that's incredibly unsettling, and I do not like that she said that at all. Number 6. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, according to group member Susan Atkins, the members of the family became convinced that Manson was a manifestation of Jesus Christ. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, on March 4th, 1971, during sentencing hearings, Manson trimmed his beard to a fork and shaved his head, telling the media, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." Then on March 29th, 1971, the jury sentenced him to death. Manson, though, died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at a hospital on November 19th, 2017. His last words were, "I'm the most famous human being not only that is alive, but the most famous human being that has ever lived." Yeah, you can tell he still had a big ego even while looking into the eyes of death. Number 5. Salvador Ramos. You may not know this man's name, but you do know his crime. On May 24th, 2022, Salvador Ramos and his 66-year-old grandmother had an argument over his failure to graduate from high school, during which he shot her in the face before taking her black 2008 Ford F-150. Ramos, using his Facebook account, sent 3 private messages to a girl from Germany whom he had met online. The first said that he was going to shoot his grandmother, the second said that he had shot his grandmother, and a third, about 15 minutes before the said that he was going to open fire at an elementary school. He went to Robb Elementary School, his former school, and fatally 19 students and 2 teachers, while 17 others were injured but survived. Now, details are still fuzzy about what happened, as it took the police forever to get into the building to take Salvador down, but what I could gather is he was in a room and opened the door and said goodnight before officers. In return, the officers back, ending his life. Number 4. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, had a highly publicized home invasion and life-ending spree that terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. Richard cultivated a strong interest in Satanism and the occult and would often commit burglaries to support his addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by ending people's lives and taking advantage of them. Now, he also frequently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided to live by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan or telling them to swear on Satan. Now, he was eventually caught, and in 1989 he was convicted of 13 counts of taking someone's life, 5 attempts of taking someone's life, 11 counts of taking advantage of a person, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and was on death row. While awaiting his scheduled death, he died on June 7th, 2013 due to health complications, but his last words were, "I am beyond good and evil, I will be avenged." All I gotta say is, I hope he doesn't get avenged. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Now, Albert once boasted that his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Westchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her into small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it." Now, this is extremely disturbing, and I cannot imagine how her mother felt, and as a result, he was executed on January 16th, 1936 in the electric chair, and his last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Which again is disturbing, because did he really think he didn't deserve to die after the horrible crimes he committed? Number 2. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was a serial slayer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He's suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone, and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry." Now again, that's just plain disturbing, as he had no remorse at all. And coming at number 1 is Jake Berg. In 1949, Jake Berg, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect for those as well. On July 15, 1949, Jake was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now the real scary thing about this is that within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to this case did die. So is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
Ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition? Well, this guy was one of its star killers. Not only do we wish it never happened in the first place, it did, so we might as well talk about it and learn from it. But we can't discuss the Inquisition without mentioning Tomás, who was responsible for thousands of deaths. He gave people 2 choices: either join the Catholic Church or die, which led to thousands of Jewish and Islamic people being exiled from Spain. He played the role of inquisitor and was in charge of investigating and punishing heretics. He oversaw the burning of thousands of innocent people, as Tomás often used cruel methods of extracting confessions from people he believed to be heretics. He seemed to almost enjoy his job, hanging, burning, suffocating, and tormenting people with the rack and waterboarding. No one knows exactly how many people died during the Inquisition, but historians estimate anywhere between 30,000 to 300,000. Pretty wide gap there. Number 9. Caligula. Man, his name is too fun to say. Too bad he wasn't a fun guy. It's better I tell you now that essentially this list is a depiction of what happens when the wrong people get their hands on power. From 37 AD to 41 AD, Caligula ruled as if he was some kind of mad god that needed to be satisfied. Not only did his addiction to gambling cause a nightmare for the economy, he seemed to delight in suffering. In the first 3 months of his rule, he made his people sacrifice 160,000 animals in his name. When he first took over as ruler, people actually liked him though. He made helpful political reforms and recalled exiles, but most people blame his future tyranny on a brain fever that befell him later on. He blew money on lavish projects, some still helpful like aqueducts, to building a 2-mile long floating bridge across the Bay of Bali so he could ride his horse across it day after day. He even ordered his men to attack the sea by collecting shells with their helmets. His lascivious love affairs included copulating with the wives of his allies and even allegedly his own sisters. Caligula's reign was equal parts terrifying and embarrassing, which is probably why his officers stabbed him to death. Number 8. Leopold II of Belgium. During the height of colonialism, Leopold of Belgium wanted to make his mark by conquering the African Congo. As soon as I said colonialism, you know where things are going, so get ready. He made it his property, and instead of, being a good human being, he decided to establish a dictatorship instead. He made the rest of Europe think that he was acting as a good guy, so they'd give him money, then proceeded to hire mercenaries. These mercenaries were set with the task of draining as much money from the state by enforcing free labor camps. Anyone who disobeyed or failed to meet demands were severely punished and even had their limbs removed. Leopold was responsible for the deaths of 20% of the population and thankfully was stopped before he could do more damage. Roger Casement, after doing a little digging, released a report which detailed the horrors he had committed under the guise of philanthropy. He was forced to surrender the Congo, though it was considered a part of Belgium until the 1950s. Buckle up folks, it only gets worse from here. It's number 7 and we're already at Genghis Khan. Get ready. already. Genghis Khan, ruler of the Mongolian Empire, killed so many people. He changed the carbon footprint of the earth. In one single battle, he killed over 1.2 million people. Though this sounds like an exaggeration, I don't find it hard to believe, since he just left the corpses to rot. The battlefields became oily and whole mountains of bodies formed. Genghis Khan was supposedly responsible for over 40 million deaths. If you need a number to compare that to, that's the same amount of people who died in World War I altogether. He also enjoyed in excess the spoils of war, brutalizing women and assaulting them. In addition to that, he held mass beauty contests, and all those who didn't win would be given to his soldiers like objects. Because of that, around 16 million people are said to be descendants of him today. That's how many people he... Many people blame his brutal and ruthless upbringing, as Khan very much had to raise himself under the mentality to kill or be killed. He even killed his own brother at age 10 just for not sharing food. He was also horrendous when it came to tormenting his betrayers. Some ways include pouring molten silver down their throats and sawing people in half while they were still alive. Oh, and he killed 75% of the population of Iran and tried to commit an entire genocide. Yeah, the list goes on, but so does this list, and there is more to come, so let's go. Number 6, Talat Pasha. Pasha was the Grand Vizier to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century and was the main architect of the Armenian genocide. When Armenian families were evicted from their homes in 1915, his signature was on the orders. On April 24th, they executed several hundred intellectuals in order to begin Turkifying the country. Many were sent through the Mesopotamian desert on death marches without food or water after being stripped naked so the sun would just boil them alive. Anyone who stopped walking was shot. He also created a special organization made of killers and ex-convicts who were ordered to carry out the liquidation of the Christian elements. They drowned people in rivers, threw civilians off cliffs, even crucified and burned people alive. Yep, this happened in the 1900s, by the way. So there are about 600,000 to 1.5 million reasons we wish this man never existed, because that is how many people Pasha was responsible for killing. Ooh, man. Number 5, Idi Amin. General Idi Amin staged a coup on January 25th, 1971 and forced Uganda's first Prime Minister Milton Obote into exile. From there, he created a reign of terror that abused Uganda's freedom after more than 70 years of British rule. Amin organized mass executions of Akoli and Lango Christian tribes who were loyal to Obote. He terrorized his own country with internal security forces whose main purpose was to eliminate those who opposed him. His brutality also resulted in the collapse of the economy. This man just seemed like he just didn't have a single good bone in his body. He was also rumored to have eaten human flesh, and his vicious and inhumane rule resulted in the death of 300,000 civilians. Eventually Amin was forced to flee and sought refuge in Saudi Arabia, though he was never punished for his crimes and died in 2003 due to organ failure. So he got away with it, essentially. Number 4, Pol Pot. You'd think a leader's job would be to protect and serve their country with love and respect, but I guess Pol Pot didn't see it that way. Originally named Salah Sar, Pot was the leader of the Khmer Rouge totalitarian regime during 1975 to 79 in Cambodia, though technically longer. It was a radical communist government who caused the death of more than 2 million people through forced labor, starvation, disease, torment, persecution, and execution. He wanted to purify society and wanted to extinguish capitalism, Western culture, city life, religion, and all foreign influences in order to form a pure communist regime. All media outlets, along with embassies and external medical help, were refused, and essentially he barricaded Cambodia into their own little world. Education was halted, healthcare eliminated. It was crazy. The people were forced into slave labor on the killing fields, only allowed 180 grams of rice a day. Deadly purges were conducted to eliminate remnants of the old society, including monks, police, doctors, lawyers, teachers, ex-soldiers along with their families, and former government officials. His cruelty and madness knew no bounds. It took years for him to finally be put under house arrest by his peers and was never truly punished for his crimes against humanity. He died of a heart attack in 1998 following his arrest. So, yeah. And we're reaching our top 3. I bet you thought number 3 was gonna be number 1. Nope, there were worse people than him, believe it or not. Number 3, we have Adolf. I can't say his last name because apparently YouTube won't let me, which is ridiculous. He's not Voldemort, but you know who I'm talking about, that really evil German guy. Yeah, I don't really need to go into detail here unless you don't know about one of the most infamous genocides to take place in all of history. Along with the amount of people Adolf's army killed in World War II, his warped and disgusting worldview resulted in the destruction of more than 6 million lives, mainly those of Jewish descent, but LGBTQ, political prisoners, and basically anyone he and his followers deemed a lesser human. He was the personification of hatred and led the world into one of the most deadly wars to date. We should also give a shout out to all of his henchmen who served underneath him, all working together to enact one of the cruelest moments in history. If he hadn't been born, who knows if it would have happened anyways due to political and social tensions of the time, but maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't have happened at all, and all those lives would still be around today. Number 2, guys, like I knew he was bad, but dug deep today, and I would never thought I would say this, but number 2, Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin made his own henchmen disappear in photos, and boy do we wish it was him instead. Stalin was the premier of the Soviet Union and was responsible for the deaths of more than 20 million of his own people, double that if you count World War II. He ruled for 30 years and ruled with an iron fist, eliminating anyone who opposed him, and as you can guess, there were many. In 1927 and 1929, he had 1 million people exiled or imprisoned, 9 to 11 million were forced off their lands, and 3 million peasants were arrested or exiled in the mass collectivization program. 6 to 7 million were killed by artificial famine in the 1930s. During 1936 to 1938, he executed approximately 750,000 during the Great Terror, a brutal political campaign to remove dissenters and any others he considered a threat. He was so paranoid. This guy had no regard for human life whatsoever. While the world was focused on Adolf, he was doing all of this, and he was fighting on the Allies' side, though we started supporting Hitler, and then he came onto our side. Anyways. It is estimated that Stalin orchestrated the deaths of 60 million people, which means about 40,000 people died every week during his reign. Need I say more? And if you think that's bad. Number 1 spot, Mao Zedong. Ready? I don't think anyone can be. Mao Zedong during 1966 to 1976 turned China into a house of fear by eradicating 65 million people. In his attempt for a socialist China, he killed anyone that got in his way, kinda like Stalin, through execution and mass starvation. His biggest threat was the intellect, and revered Emperor Xi Huang, who buried 460 scholars and sought to surpass him by burying alive 46,000 scholars. Yep. My stomach turned when I read that. That's awful. He coined his operation the Great Leap Forward. To combat rising resistance, he created the Red Army, composed of girls and boys from the ages of 14 to 21 to roam cities and target enemies of the state, especially their teachers. He would make the teachers wear dunce hats, cover their faces with ink, and make them crawl on all fours and bark like dogs. He also expanded a system of 1,000 forced labor camps. Most amazing fam, I could go on, but I honestly don't have room. It just seems like there's no end to all the awful things that he did. For all these reasons and more, Mao is of course in our number 1 spot.
Hachishaku-sama. Known as the Japanese Slender Man, this Japanese legend makes Slender Man seem like a walk in the park. First up, she's tall. I mean, imagine peeking out your window and seeing an 8-foot tall lady staring back at you. Instant chills. And when she gets close, she makes this spine-tingling sound, like kinda giving you a heads up that she's coming. But here's where it gets really scary. She only goes after individuals who haven't been on Earth for very long. Why? Well, some think it's because she feeds off their energy or potential, and also because they're easier to lure. Plus, she can mimic voices, even your loved ones, trying to trick you into opening up your door, and poof, you're gone. And get this, once you see her, you're pretty much marked for doom. There's a ritual to shake her off, and it involves some Buddha statues, salt, and leaving Japan forever. Pretty tough deal. Oh, and she rocks this long white dress, a classic ghostly choice, but the kicker is that she can actually appear as quite attractive, despite being so tall, which makes her scarier. In a nutshell, she's like this vengeful spirit ramped up with the scary look, an eerie sound, and a taste for younger people. Super spooky. At number 9 is the Highway of Tears Unaliver. Now, while the US normally comes to mind when thinking about the serial unaliver phenomena, Canada is actually home to a plethora of unsolved serial unalivings. Great. The notorious Highway of Tears in British Columbia, spanning 450 miles between Prince George and Prince Rupert, harbors a haunting legacy of tragedy. Approximately 18 to 40 individuals, primarily indigenous women, have either disappeared or met a tragic end along this route from 69 to 2011. This chilling series of incidents spans over 5 decades, indicating the potential involvement of multiple perpetrators. Law enforcement, particularly the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, faced immense challenges in solving these cases. Regrettably, only one unaliving led to prosecution, leaving 17 other cases unsolved. The complexity lies in the multiple unalivers suspected lurking along the highway, making tracking their actions over the years incredibly difficult. While authorities have linked one individual to a couple of the unalivings, the majority remain unattributed. The shadow of these unsolved cases suggests the likely existence of additional culprits who have yet to be apprehended. If you're enjoying this spooky video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing the notification bell. I don't see why not, because it is free, and it helps us out, so please do that. At number 8 is the Sitter. The Oakland County minor unaliver, also referred to as the Sitter, was an unidentified serial assailant responsible for the unalivings of at least 4 young people in Oakland County, Michigan between 76 and 77. This individual earned the moniker due to a pattern observed in the crimes where each victim was bathed before the tragic events, leading the authorities to speculate on potential psychological motives behind the unaliver's actions. The impact of the crimes reverberated profoundly, causing widespread fear and concern among parents throughout Michigan. Numerous community watch programs were initiated, emphasizing the need for heightened vigilance and safety measures for the vulnerable. Despite exhaustive investigative efforts and several leads, including a vehicle linked to the perpetrator, the case still remains unsolved. A significant breakthrough occurred in 2012 when a DNA profile was obtained, but unfortunately, no match was found within law enforcement databases or associated with any arrests made in connection to the case. The extended duration of the victim's captivity, lasting from several days to nearly 3 weeks, adds to the disturbing nature of these tragic events. Number 7 is the Smiling Man. The Smiling Man is a chilling narrative that comes from someone's real experience on a late night walk. This story was shared on a Reddit forum called r/Let's Not Meet. So now the thing is, this thread is for real life encounters, not made up stories. It describes an eerie encounter with a man on a quiet Seattle street, and it goes a little something like this. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I enjoyed taking late night walks to pass the time, but one night, while strolling near a quiet park, something eerie happened. As I turned onto a side street, I noticed a man dancing in the distance. The movement seemed odd, like a waltz with an unusual forward step. Initially, I assumed he might be intoxicated, so I moved to give him some space. However, as he drew nearer, his graceful movements surprised me. His appearance was unsettling. He was tall, thin, and wore an old suit. His eyes were wide, gazing up into the sky, and his smile seemed unnatural. I decided to cross the street, feeling uncomfortable, but when I glanced back, he stood motionless, staring at me with that unsettling smile. Though I tried to put distance between us, he vanished briefly, only to reappear even closer. Feeling unnerved, I quickly walked away, yet each time I looked back, he appeared closer and closer. This continued until he started to move rapidly towards me. Despite feeling frozen in fear, I eventually fled to a more illuminated area, losing sight of the creepy Smiling Man. At number 6 is the Expressionless Woman. Now this one is just demonic. There was an infamous incident in 1972 at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles when a woman, devoid of any facial expression akin to that of a mannequin, enters the hospital's premise, her gown stained with the bodily fluids of a kitten with its remains still clenched in her jaw. The hospital staff tried to aid her, but things took a nightmarish turn. After a brief cooperation, she turned hostile, attacking the staff. Security intervention led to her biting a guard's jugular. When questioned about her identity, she ominously declared herself as God before just vanishing, leaving behind the legend of the Expressionless Woman. At number 5 is the Graveyard Demon of Dagestan. This was a spooky legend in Russian history. Different folks in Dagestan told stories about this eerie creature, and they all had a similar picture in mind. They saw it as a tall, thin thing dressed in white, sometimes with a face you couldn't see. Could be invisible or look like a real being. Now, the demon liked to hang out in graveyards or empty houses, making creepy sounds at night. Some folks thought only bad people could see it, while others believed it could scare anybody. Legend said that the demon was once a person who didn't get enough gifts after they passed away, or it was a bad person who turned into this scary thing. The details are not very clear. People who encountered this thing felt weak or sick afterwards, like it drained their energy. Some thought you could prevent bad stuff by saying some special prayers or doing rituals like hanging an empty eggshell or nail to protect the living from their relatives. Kinda weird. At number 4 is the Roanoke demon. Roanoke Island's tale is a fascinating mystery from American history. That rhymed. In the late 16th century, a group of English settlers arrived at Roanoke in what is now North Carolina. They established a colony, but things took a bizarre turn when their colony leader, John White, went back to England for supplies. When White returned a few years later, he found the settlement deserted with no signs of struggle or battle. The clues were dismantled, and the only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved on a post, and crow on a nearby tree. Now, some people think that the settlers might have integrated with local natives, the Croatoans, but there's another chilling theory. Now, I'm gonna assert that this claim comes from the internet and not from the Croatoans themselves, but supposedly, legends among the Native American tribes spoke of an ancient ritual to summon a powerful entity, a demon, meant to protect their land from intruders. It's said that this ritual was performed when they felt their territory was threatened by outsiders, and according to these legends, the settlers' disappearance might have been linked to this ritual, a desperate attempt by the indigenous people to protect their land from the encroaching colonizers. At number 3 is the Zodiac. Imagine a creature wandering the streets at night, peeking through windows and giving everybody the creeps. Meet the Zodiac, a character from Russian folklore. The Zodiac was super tall and skinny, like a long tree trunk without its branches. Sort of like a sad wanderer, condemned to wander aimlessly forever. People don't really know much about him, just that he liked scaring folks by peeking into their homes or warming his hands in chimneys. But here's where it gets more interesting. Some stories link Zodiac to a big bad guy named Koschei the Immortal. Koschei was a typical bad dude in Slavic tales, a skinny tall elder or a wandering skeleton who used magic and kidnapped little people. And guess what? No hero could easily beat him. Now, we're not totally sure about the connection between these two characters, because there's not a lot of info about these guys in Russian folklore. At number 2 is the Chupacabra Man. The Chupacabra is a legendary creature known for attacking livestock, especially goats, and drinking their bodily fluids like a vampire. But what if I told you that there might be another mysterious figure behind these goat unalivings? In a small Mexican village, farmers have been losing their goats in bizarre ways. Now, most blame the Chupacabra, depicting the mysterious cryptid creature demon thing, but apparently, the Chupacabra might have actually been a real person. It was rumored that this mysterious being had a deep-seated grudge against the farmers, seeking revenge for an ancient betrayal. You see, legend has it that this figure was once a respected herder in the valley. However, when a severe drought struck, the farmers accused him of stealing their water supply to save his own herd, as most of the other farmers' flock had perished, but not his. They then proceeded to totally pillage the dude. However, this farmer lived, vanished into the shadows, and swore vengeance, which he got by, apparently, sucking the juices out of the other farmers' goats. Yeah, seems legit. At number 1 is the Servant Annihilator. This dude takes the top spot, as this unsolved case is actually one of the very first American serial unalivers. Oh goody. This creepy person went around unaliving 7 women and a man in Austin, Texas between 84 and 85. Now, what's chilling is that all these victims worked as house helpers, and this guy attacked them while they were sleeping or pulled them out of their homes to unalive them. In one really scary night in 1885, this unaliver used an axe to unalive 3 people, earning himself the nickname the Austin Axe Unaliver. The police back then had a hard time figuring things out, and all the records are pretty spotty since it happened over 125 years ago. Some people think that the Axe Unaliver might have been Jack the Ripper, who caused chaos in London a few years later. However, other people think it's a local guy named Nathan Elgin, who had a distinctive foot with only 4 toes, matching footprints found on the crime scene. He was unalived by a police officer in 1886 while trying to help a woman named Julia from this drunk dude attacking her outside a saloon. Thankfully, this terrifying unaliver is long gone, considering it happened so many years ago. I mean, if it was in fact this dude and not Jack the Ripper.
Grigory Rasputin, born in 1869 in a small Siberian village, he grew up as a peasant. He was also a mystic and grew up to become quite close with the Russian royal family after seemingly healed Alexei Nikolaevich, the son of Nicholas II and heir to the Russian throne. Alexei was a hemophiliac, meaning his blood didn't clot properly, and Rasputin, after being called to the palace of Nicholas and Alexandra, seemed to ease his symptoms. This was miraculous, and the royal family put their full trust in this mysterious holy man who would go on to have sleeping with any woman he could within the palace, but he was also known to force himself on women. But because Nicholas and Alexandra were so enamored with his supposed power, any concern or report about him was completely written off. It seemed that everyone on the outside wanted the guy gone though, seeing how he was pulling Nicholas and Alexandra's strings, controlling them like puppets, and there were a number of attempts to take Rasputin's life, but this guy was hard to take down. He was stabbed and recovered, poisoned with cyanide which had no effect. He was shot and was seemingly dead before springing up like Michael Myers at the end of Halloween. He was then shot again before being wrapped up in a blanket and thrown in a river where he finally drowned. Number 9. Gilles de Rais. Born in 1404, Gilles de Rais was a French nobleman and a respected military leader, but he had a secret life. He was responsible for viciously taking the lives of countless young ones and was said to be a practitioner of black magic and conducted occult rituals, leading many to believe that he possessed otherworldly abilities. This guy was an absolute monster. If you want to talk about true evil, this is it right here. His servants, mostly young men, very young men, and other young ones around his castles, started going missing, and rumors started to spread that Gilles de Rais was disposing of them, something that turned out to be true when witnesses began seeing servants disposing of bodies. Many were afraid to speak out against him, though, due to the immense gap in class that was present at the time. He was finally arrested in 1440, though, and under the threat of excruciating punishment, he admitted to his crimes, actually revealing that he would take the lives of his victims in these dark, occult-like rituals. Next on the list, we have Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, born August 7th, 1560, was a Hungarian noblewoman notorious for being one of the most prolific female serial killers in history. She's often remembered as the Blood Countess because of her horrifying crimes. Bathory was accused of tormenting and taking the lives of numerous young females. Her methods included severe beatings, burning, and disfigurement. And what she's most famous for, though, was her belief that bathing in her victim's blood would preserve her youth. It's said that she may have taken the lives of hundreds in her quest for eternal beauty. Her actions eventually caught the attention of authorities. In 1610, she was arrested and her accomplices were put on trial, and the accounts from witnesses and survivors painted a very chilling picture of her cruelty. She was never officially tried in court, but was confined to a windowless room in her castle until her death in 1614. Number 7. Aleister Crowley. Crowley, born in 1875, was an English occultist and ceremonial magician, founded the religion of Thelema. He was a prominent and very controversial guy, especially at the time, known as the Great Beast 666. He was an occultist, writer, and ceremonial magician, a man of many mysteries and oddities. Crowley was known for more than just his eccentric lifestyle, though. One of the big questions surrounding him is whether he actually had any mystical powers or was just really good at talking the talk. Crowley wasn't shy about bragging that he could communicate with supernatural beings. He claimed to have a direct line to a being named Aiwass, who supposedly dictated to him the Book of the Law, basically the Bible of Thelema. Then there's the curious case of his rituals. Crowley was all about strange ceremonies, often involving weird symbols and chants, and even some bizarre sexual practices. As to whether he was evil, I mean, some would definitely say he was, but yeah, certainly not like most of the others on this list. Like this next guy, for example. And at number 6, Thug Behram. Thug Behram, born in 1765, became infamous as the ruthless leader of the Thuggee cult in India during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Thuggee were a secret criminal society that specialized in robbery and murder, targeting unsuspecting travelers. What made the Thuggee particularly sinister was their method of operation. They would often befriend and gain the trust of their victims on the road, only to then strangle them with a rummel, a cloth, and this kind of ritualistic fashion, allowing them to carry out their crimes discreetly. Behram was one of the most notorious Thuggee leaders, believed to have taken the lives of hundreds. he actually admitted to witnessing 931 people die right in front of him, and that's not even counting the ones he had a direct hand in. Under his leadership, the thugs terrorized India for years with a well-organized network that spanned the country. He was eventually captured and put to death in 1840. Next, we have H.H. Holmes. Holmes was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. Although he was highly intelligent from a young age, he displayed all your classic disturbing signs early on. He would capture and torture animals, cutting into them and performing strange experiments. Holmes, whose real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, not quite as intimidating sounding, committed crimes that were as horrifying as they were calculated. He constructed this nightmarish castle in Chicago, specifically equipped with secret passageways and soundproof rooms and gas chambers, which were all made to assist with his gruesome crimes. He would lure numerous victims, mostly young women, surprise, surprise, into his property, and once inside, they came face to face with unimaginable horrors, including excruciating torment, asphyxiation, and dissection. The exact number of his victims isn't 100% known, but it could be anywhere from just 9 to over 200. I'm guessing it's somewhere in between. In 1896, he was finally convicted for his crimes and sentenced to death. Number 4, Gil Garnier. Here we have a real-life werewolf case, at least the closest thing possible. Gil Garnier, aka the Hermit of St. Benoît and the Werewolf of Dole, was a reclusive man born at some point in the mid-1500s in France. He lived in an isolated home just outside the town of Dole. His new wife moved out to the home with him, and it was at this point that something changed in Garnier. He had always hunted food for himself, but now having to provide for another person, it was difficult, and this started driving a wedge between him and his wife, and he started getting desperate. It was at this point that several young ones in the area started being found mauled to death with parts of their bodies having been eaten. Meaning this had to have been the work of some large animal, right? But it wasn't. It was Garnier. Garnier's crimes came to light when a group of traveling workers had spotted him eating the body of one of his victims in the dead of night. At first, they thought they were looking at a wolf. According to Garnier, he had been hunting one night when a ghostly figure came to him, telling him it would imbue him with the power to transform into a wolf, making it easier for him to hunt. Since that night, he had stalked and hunted a number of young people, most of which died as a result of his savage attacks. He was burnt at the stake in 1574, accused of lycanthropy and witchcraft. I don't know what it was with guys named Gilles in France back then, but they didn't like young folks, apparently. Number 3, Vlad the Impaler, the original vampire himself. If there's anyone in history that just feels like they stepped out of some portal from another dark dimension, it's this guy. Vlad was born in 1431. He was a tyrant renowned for his brutal methods of punishing enemies, often impaling them on long spikes. His reputation for cruelty gave rise to the legend that is Dracula, inspiring Bram Stoker's famous vampire novel. Alongside these gruesome acts, there are legends suggesting Vlad may have possessed otherworldly powers. Tales kind of hint at his ability to control the weather, summon dark forces, or even transform into a vampire-like creature. The line between fact and fiction often blurs with this guy. Some believe that his cruelty was more than human, that maybe he had something supernatural lurking inside him, some sort of dark entity from beyond. He just inspired this intense fear and awe in his time, and his brutality definitely unquestionable, but the idea of him being an actual vampire, most likely just legend, but fun to imagine. And at number 2, we have Jack the Ripper, a name everyone has heard before. One of the first cases of the type of modern day serial killer we hear about all the time now, only this man was never identified. Jack the Ripper terrorized the Whitechapel district of London in 1888 and remains one of the most infamous figures in criminal history. Victims were taken out in the most gruesome ways possible. They looked like they had been mauled to death by a 500-pound brown bear. Jack primarily targeted female workers of the night, brutally mutilating their bodies. The sheer level of ferocity of these attacks and the fact that he was never caught really has fueled the theories and speculations over the years about him. He taunted the police with letters that were apparently from him, signed as Jack the Ripper. There have been intensive investigations and a number of suspects that have kind of come up over the years that could have been him, but his true identity has never been definitively proven. Finally, we have Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler was a high-ranking German official during World War II. He had a deep and disturbing fascination with the occult. He believed he could summon dark forces to help him shape a new world order and tried to incorporate his beliefs into the ideology of the regime. He established a research institute to explore ancient and supernatural phenomena. Under his direction, he conducted these expeditions to search for evidence of Aryan origins, looking into topics like ancient artifacts, astrology, folklore, and this interest extended to the dark and the occult, as Himmler believed that tapping into these mystical forces would help the German forces gain more power and control. He promoted pseudo-scientific theories, obviously related to racial purity and mysticism, and saw the SS almost as this more modern-day knightly kind of order. Such a bizarre side of the Second World War. It feels like something out of Hellboy, but this really was a thing. The German forces were really dabbling in this type of occult stuff at the time.
10 is the Colonial Parkway Killer. An active criminal between 1986 to 1989, this person specifically targeted couples traveling Virginia's scenic parkway late at night. During that time, 3 couples were found dead and 1 couple went missing but is presumed to have the same fate. A different couple was found each year, leading authorities to question, was this person only killing once a year, or were this just the ones they found? The cases had received major media coverage, including documentaries, news articles, and TV shows as recent as 2021, but despite having over 130 suspects, the FBI have yet to be able to put a name to the face of the crimes. One bizarre piece of this puzzle is that in 2010, a note was discovered in a box taken years earlier from one of the victims' apartments. The note stated that she was to meet someone in a blue van at a rest stop, and when the Virginia State Police was asked about this, they claimed that the note had been previously examined. But in 1989, during the time of the murders, an investigator involved told case reporters that he was unaware of the existence of the note. So, if you ever find yourself driving the scenic route of Virginia, do yourself a favor and don't make a pit stop. Next up at number 9 is Glenn Stewart Godwin. In 1996, this killer was added to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's top 10 most wanted list after he escaped from a California prison back in 1987. At the time of his escape, he was serving a 26 to life sentence for the death of Kim LaValle. Trying to hide the body, took her up a mountain and decided to use a homemade explosive in an attempt to make the remains disappear. However, residents of the mountain only a few months later came across some remains, thus sparking his arrest. When he escaped prison in 1987, he fled to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico and joined up with a cartel, but was found and convicted in 1991 and sent to jail in Guadalajara. It was here that he took the life of a fellow inmate and then escaped a second time only 5 months later. Authorities have yet to track him down after 31 years, but it is believed that he is still on the loose today. So, keep your eyes peeled if you're ever in Latin America, because the FBI is offering a $20,000 reward for anyone with information that could lead to his arrest. Next up at number 8 is Bible John. Active between 1968 and 1969 in Glasgow, Scotland, the man nicknamed Bible John is believed to be responsible for the death of 3 young women. All 3 of his victims were young brunettes who he would lure in at a local dance hall in the city. The unidentified criminal is referred to as Bible John, as according to a key witness, saw a man who picked up women yet quoted extensively from the Old Testament and frowned on adultery. But of course, course, taking the lives of young women seemed alright in his books. For decades, the Glasgow police have tirelessly searched for the monster, but have remained unsuccessful in tracking him down. To date, the search for Bible John has been the most extensive manhunt in Scotland criminal history. It was also the first time in Scotland's history that a composite drawing of the perpetrator was allowed and publicized in an attempt to get more information from the public. Although there have been a few suspects over the years, none have been convicted, and to this day it is unknown who is responsible for these horrible attacks. Next up at number 7 is the Monster of Florence. Active between 1968 and 1985 in Florence, Italy, this man is responsible for the death of 8 young couples who he would target while they snuck away into the woods trying to be intimate outside of their homes. Now, in 1970s Italy, this could be a common occurrence, as it was customary for young couples to not live with each other until marriage, and with nowhere else to go, sometimes the great outdoors was their only alternative. The part about this that really gets under your skin is that the female victims would be found mutilated, with their intimate areas removed with, quote, a surgical precision that led police to believe he had a medical background. More than 100,000 men were investigated for these crimes, with some being arrested or even tried, but eventually another killing would occur, exonerating them and forcing police to continue their search. The search continued for this gruesome monster, and a local farmer named Pietro Pacini was convicted in 1994 for 6 of the killings, but later in 1996 it was overturned. Pacini then died a few years later, but it is strongly believed he did not work alone, and while 5 accused men have been sent to jail at one point or another, they were all eventually released, leaving this case wide open with the alleged convict running free. Coming in at number 6, we have the Upstairs Lounge Fire. In June of 1973, a New Orleans gay bar was the victim of the second worst attack on the American queer community, only surpassed in 2016 by the Pulse nightclub massacre. The Upstairs Lounge was a beloved hub with drag queens and music, but sadly on this 1973 Pride weekend, everything would change. The bar was located on the 2nd floor of the building, and out of nowhere patrons started to smell gasoline, but initially thought nothing of it. A few minutes later, a doorbell rang, and when someone opened to see who was there, a fireball was thrown into the room and immediately erupted the room into an inferno. It is now known the perpetrator used a Molotov cocktail. The fire burned fast, lasting only 20 minutes, but in that time, 32 lost their lives and another 15 were severely injured by the attack. The survivors of the fire were taken to identify the bodies of those who died in the tragedy, but according to one survivor, many of the identified bodies remained unclaimed by family members as they were ashamed and wanted nothing to do with their gay kin. After the attacks, many survivors refused to show their faces, afraid of the homophobia that would follow due to the media coverage. No arrests were ever made, and it's very likely that whoever committed this atrocity continues to walk the streets of New Orleans to this day. Next up at number 5, the Stoneman. Active between the years of 1985 to 1988 in Mumbai, India, this mysterious criminal was never caught. Believed to be responsible for the death of 26 people, the Stoneman got their name due to their cruel methods. The Stoneman would target homeless people sleeping alone on the streets at night and used concrete blocks or stones, sometimes weighing up to 65 pounds to carry out their gruesome plan. According to the media, 12 people died at the hands of the Stoneman in Mumbai, India between 1985 to 1988, and then they moved to Calcutta where another 12 people were found dead in a single year. Now, it's not known for sure if the Calcutta killer was the same as whoever committed the atrocities in Mumbai. Authorities did mention it could have been a copycat, but most seem to believe it was all one person, or at least a group of people working together. No one has been charged for any of the crimes, and all remain unsolved. Coming in at number 4, the Doodler. This next criminal was from San Francisco and active for just 1 year between 1974 to 1975. However, in that year, the unidentified killer is believed to have taken 16 lives. He was known to target specifically white men in gay clubs and got his name as he was known to sit around doodling pictures of them to draw them in. Once they got to talking, he would lure them elsewhere, like a lake or a park, and follow through with the rest of his evil plan. Unfortunately, due to the rampant homophobia of the time, when police did find a suspect for the case, they couldn't proceed with criminal charges, as none of the 3 surviving victims of the brutal attacks felt safe to out themselves publicly by testifying in court, fearful of how the consequences might impact their daily lives. The case remains open with no known suspect of who committed the crimes, and in 2019 the police offered a $100,000 reward to anyone with more information of the killer. Next up at number 3, the Craigslist Ripper. Also known as the Long Island Killer, this man is thought to be responsible for the death of 17 people between the years of 1996 to 2010, and got his name as he was known to target women of the night who advertised their services on Craigslist. Although his crimes began in 1996, none of his victims were found until 2010, many wrapped up in sacks or garbage bags along the Long Island shore. It's speculated that he may have been, or that he currently is, a police officer, as whoever committed these crimes seemed to have an in-depth knowledge of the investigation techniques not typically known by just anyone. Sadly, of the 17 found, only 5 have been able to be properly identified due to the nature of how he left the bodies. Coming in at number 2, the Zodiac Killer. Possibly the most famous repeat convict known to date, this criminal is as scary as it gets. Active in California during the late 60s and early 70s, the Zodiac Killer seemed to get off on the chase, sending in letters and highly encrypted clues to the police that supposedly would reveal his identity and more, if only the puzzles could be deciphered. Not only would he send in cards to the police, but he was known to mail in his taunting clues to local newspapers, threatening awful consequences if they were not printed. There are 7 known victims that he is known to be responsible for, 2 surviving his brutal attacks, although he claims to have killed 37. The especially creepy part about this particular monster is that, as detailed in his letters, he believed that all those whose life he ended would become his slaves in the afterlife, and that he would be sent to paradise. Although the Zodiac ceased all written communication by 1974, the case remained open since 1969, with no known perpetrator. And last up in our number 1 spot, Issei Sagawa. Nicknamed the Kobe Cannibal, this monster is not for the faint of heart. Now, unlike others on the list, he's only known for 1 brutal attack, but what he did will leave you speechless. Sagawa was born in Japan and says he had known since childhood of his gruesome instincts, but for whatever reason would always back out of his desires at the last second. All of this changed, however, when he moved to Paris to pursue his PhD. It was there that he met Renee Hartvelt, one of his classmates who he decided was the right victim. Sagawa says he picked her due to her beauty and stature, as he saw himself as weak, ugly, and small, and believed that he could absorb her energy. He invited her over on the pretense of a dinner, but knew all along what he planned to do. He had it thought out. He took the woman's life, and I'm sure you can imagine what he did with her body, considering the monster's name. After 4 days, the body began to decompose, and he knew that he had to get her out of his apartment or risk being arrested for his crimes. However, he was caught attempting to dispose of her remains in a nearby lake by French authorities and was, of course, arrested immediately. After awaiting trial for 2 years, a judge ruled him legally insane and unfit for trial, ordering him to live out the rest of his life in a mental institution. He was deported out of France and sent back to Japan, where he was immediately committed. But here's where it gets crazy. Once in this institution, the psychologist deemed him fully sane, and that his perversions were the reason for his crimes, not insanity. But since his charges had been dropped while in France, all documents were sealed and nothing was sent to Japanese authorities, meaning that legally, the institution could not detain him any longer. After only 2 years away from society, Sagawa walked out freely and remains free to this day.
Mary Ann Cotton. Cotton was hung at Durham County Jail in 1873 following a 20-year poisoning spree. Cotton is often considered Britain's first female serial killer, murdering 21 people in her time, usually for money via insurance payouts. Cotton's poison of choice was arsenic, something that she used to murder her husbands, yes, husbands plural, and her children. That's right, she killed her own children. She was later discovered when police made the connection between the loss of her 3 husbands, some friends, a friend of her mother's, her mother, and her 13 children, all of which had died from sudden stomach fevers. Coming in at number 9, we have Jim Jones. Greedy and evil, Jim Jones was the cult leader of the People's Temple and the orchestrator of the horrific Jonestown massacre. An American national Jim set up the People's Temple out of frustration with being unable to express his Marxist values. In the end, he kind of developed a god complex and started brainwashing people into thinking that he and the People's Temple were the saviors. He relocated the cult to Guyana and then named their newly acquired land Jonestown after himself. Jim manipulated the press and some respected politicians until they started to disassociate themselves from him. The American authorities became very suspicious of goings on in Jonestown after reports of violations of human rights from defectors. America sent reporters and a congressman in to investigate the cult, and Jim ordered his army to murder them. Later, realizing his time was up, he brainwashed 909 people into committing mass suicide, 300 of which were children. They all famously drank grape flavor aid laced with cyanide. Coming in at number 8, we have Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley are evil for so many reasons, not least the fact that they are disgusting child killers, and they conducted their crimes in the 60s. The pair lived in Greater Manchester and spurred one another on to kill. Their first victim was a friend of Hindley's sister. She was called Pauline Reed, and Hindley used their prior relationship to lure her into their van. Pauline was only 16 when she was sexually assaulted and murdered. The pair raped 3 more times and killed 4 more times. Their victims included 3 boys, 2 of which were aged 12, and a 10-year-old girl. The pair were later arrested following a tip-off from Hindley's brother-in-law, and they later refused to give information about the missing children's bodies to their bereaving parents, which is just horrible. Okay, so this guy comparatively seems a lot worse, but he was living in a different time, although he was absolutely a mega dick. Coming in at number 7, we have Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler was the inspiration behind the legend of Dracula, and like his fictitious counterpart, he was a very bloodthirsty chap. Vlad was alive for a mere 45 years between 1431 and 1476, but in that time it is estimated that he could have killed around 1,000 people. Vlad was Prince of Wallachia, a historic region of Romania, and to cut a really long story short, he killed everybody that stood in his way of power or threatened his position. He plundered villages and killed armies. How did he kill them? Well, he's not called Vlad the Impaler by accident. He really liked to impale his victims and then proudly display their corpses. He also impaled animals and nailed turbans to the heads of Turkish messengers. He was known to be cruel and wicked within his lifetime, with news of his evil soul becoming a popular story in German courts. Speaking of Germany, next up at number 6, we have Joseph Goebbels. Some say this top-ranking Nazi in charge of propaganda was actually way worse than Hitler himself. Deranged, jealous, and erratic, Goebbels was a vicious Jew-hating killer who was a key player in defining the Aryan race and pointing hatred towards Jews. He was also fairly key in the establishment of concentration camps, including Auschwitz. This picture of Joseph Goebbels always haunts me. This is the moment that he found out the photographer was a Jew. At the end of the war, he and his wife murdered their 6 children before committing suicide. Coming in at number 5, we have Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most prolific and infamous serial killers of all time. The American, who murdered somewhere between 30 and 100 women, was killed via the electric chair in 1989. Bundy raped most of his victims and kept souvenirs, including body parts and Polaroids of their bodies. When caught, Bundy gave a series of chilling interviews where he described himself as cold-hearted. He also revealed that he would decapitate some of his victims and then have sex with their corpses. Sometimes he would revisit his murder site and would again perform sexual acts on decomposing bodies. Bundy famously said, "We serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, we are everywhere, and there will be more of your children dead tomorrow." Oh, this guy, gross. He seemed to take a sick pride in being a killer. Coming in at number 4, we have Delphine LaLaurie. Considered one of the most evil women in the world, let alone New Orleans, this absolute historic she-devil even got her own character on American Horror Story. Delphine grew up as a young, rich beauty in a wealthy white Creole family in New Orleans. After 3 marriages, she brought her own home and installed a slave's quarter in the top floor. Beneath the shiny veneer of her lavishly furnished home, Delphine had a sick secret. The slaves' quarters were actually a secret torture and murder room. She woefully mistreated her staff, but the extent of the horror wasn't known until a fire broke out in her home. The fire marshals searched the top floor only to find a dozen people chained up with others in cages. Body parts and severed heads sat in buckets and organs were strewn across the floor. Delphine never faced justice as she fled to Paris. A recent evil up next at number 3, we have Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was a British doctor who broke the Hippocratic Oath and abused his power to carry out 218 or more sick murders. Shipman killed people by administering them with a lethal dose of diamorphine, and then he used his position as a doctor to sign their death certificates and also to doctor their medical records to suggest that they were in bad health. 80% of his victims were women, usually over the age of 50. However, Shipman has been linked to the death of a 4-year-old boy. His last victim was pensioner Kathleen Grundy, for whom he had forged a will, leaving himself in excess of £300,000. Eventually he was discovered and sent to prison in 2000, and in 2004 he hung himself on his 58th birthday, reportedly waiting this long specifically so his wife would get his £100,000 pension. Sick. Coming into number 2, it doesn't get much sicker than ISIS. Evil has threaded itself throughout history, and currently one of the most evil selections of people alive reside in a terror cell called ISIS. These deranged killers are pretty much hell-bent on destroying the West and pretend to support Islam in their quest for dominance over the East. ISIS was founded by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and the group murder and destroy in the most chaotic way. ISIS were behind the Bataclan massacre, the Tunisia Beach massacre, attacks in Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, Berlin, and many more. Not only do they carry out sick murders on innocent people, which they often film and put on the internet, they also indoctrinate young Muslims, radicalizing them and encouraging them to leave their homes and join them in Syria, or whichever underground rat hole they're living in. Finally, at number 1, we have a man who is responsible for the deaths of 45 million people. We have Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was the founding father of the People's Republic of China, which was achieved in 1949 after a brutal civil war during which the Communist Party overthrew the government. Mao was cruel on so many scales. He tortured and killed army dissenters and peasants accused of hiding food supplies. But the crux of Mao's cruelty came as he defiantly pushed the Great Leap Forward policy, which aimed to change China from a farming society to a society focused on industry. Unfortunately, this radical shift led to food shortages, sparking the Great Chinese Famine, where between 18 and 30 million Chinese people starved to death. It has been documented that Mao knew that this was happening as the rice yield was not big enough to sustain the population. He is reported to have said it was better for half the population to die so that the other half could thrive. Ultimately, his rule saw the collective untimely deaths of up to 45 million people as a result of famine and corrupt practices he used to obtain and maintain power.
If you enjoyed this video, then you have to check out this video next. It's about cybersecurity threats that are predicted to end the world. Forget these evil people in history, because this is a real concern that we might be dealing with today. Click the video now to find out more.